But before I do, I want to get one more thing in, if I could, because I thought it was so interesting and I hadn't thought about it. You're talking about globalization and how I'm going to put it my way. This is what I learned from you, and you tell me if I've interpreted it correctly. And what you're doing here is you're really integrating work of Robert Allen and Richard Baldwin in the way they looked at globalization. And so let me try to put it where I can think about it. In the past, the wealthy nations went to visit a poorer nation to exploit it. They extracted natural resources. They sometimes enslaved the people who lived there, and sometimes brutalized them in terrible ways. The colonial imperialistic past of the West is not a pretty picture. Sure, some good things came of it for the native populations, not many. Certainly not at the time. What has changed with globalization, and that was a form of globalization, right? That you sent your ships out. You were Columbus or you were whoever, and you explored the rest of the world, and you often dominated it militarily and then economically. What changed somewhere along the line, which I found so interesting, is that once these poorer economies got integrated into the global supply chain, the richer nations and the economic players within those nations had an incentive for the first time to improve the technologies there on the ground overseas, over there. And you talk about the disconnect between consumption and production. What's produced over there is now consumed here. That's a big innovation. But there's this other innovation of what's produced over there is monitored and managed from over here. And because of that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that things that I would never have cared about before, which is whether they have access to world-class technology, suddenly I have an interest and incentive to do so, and that's going to inevitably lift up their standard of living. And what I think about is that, a sweater factory in China 50 years ago was a group of women with knitting needles, literally knitting sweaters by hand. It's not anymore. It's not a sweater factory in Mexico anymore. It's not a sweater factory in Indonesia. That factory looks like a factory anywhere in the world. And the exporting of technology because of the globalization of supply chains is a story that I didn't appreciate until I read your book. Do I have that roughly correct?
No, you have it absolutely correct. I have to say that actually the gist or the most of that story comes from Richard Baldwin. And I think it's absolutely true because it actually shows that being integrated into global supply chains solves the problem, quote unquote, which existed in the past. Because I'm old enough to remember, for example, in the 70s and the 80s, there was permanent complaints by the third world countries that the rich countries are really unwilling to share technology with them. What the global value chain does is gives the incentive to the original company in the West to actually share best technology with with actually people working in a poor country. And what was also interesting there, that was actually work of Bob Allen. Bob Allen actually looked at the sort of technological advances and so forth, and actually he found very interesting result that as countries, for example, I take the United States. The U.S. today doesn't have really any incentive to improve technology at the level of wage, which is like $1 per hour, for example. So what Bob Allen found is that countries which are actually still poor today, in the past and still now, really do not have technology that is appropriate for improvement in technology, which is appropriate for their level of development. So they have to really go back to the technology which might have existed like 150 years ago in this country. But what global value chains do is they actually have an incentive to find the appropriate technology for that country at that level of wage rate because they're paying that level of wage rate. So, when I see all these issues now with China so-called stealing intellectual property rights and technology, not only is it also done oftentimes by the American companies because they wanted to have access to Chinese market, which is of course very often the case, it's because they often really care about the factories there because they are integral part of their own company.